Hello, thank you, Ruby. So welcome also on my behalf to everybody to the last webinar of 2023 in the OWASPA webinar series, made possible through thanks to the sponsors listed on the next slide. I want to start us off with some small practical announcements. First, you're in good company, very good company, as no less than 782 people registered from 60 different countries and from over 500 different institutions. So thanks to all of you for joining us from wherever time zone or wherever region you're from. We have 75 minutes during which I will give a brief introduction. Then we will hear statements from the four panelists, followed by the Q&A and your input, of course, on which we depend. So as said, please remember to put your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat. We will do our best to address as many of these questions as possible, but typically people who have joined us for webinars before, if you don't get to all of them, we typically also follow up offline after the webinar. And as said, this webinar is also being recorded and the recording will be made available shortly afterwards. Now on to the content. I would like to open this webinar by quoting the opening sentence of an article published in 2016 by Joanna Ball, one of our panelists today. This opening sentence reads, "The transformation of academic content presents both a direct challenge and new opportunities to the role of libraries. A direct challenge on the one hand, new opportunities on the other." We felt that it was timely, about 7 years after the appearance of that article, to devote a webinar discussing these challenges and opportunities and looking at the state of things. Are these challenges and opportunities still the same? Have libraries picked up on them? If so, how have they done that? And were they successful at all? It is, for instance, a fact that research libraries worldwide for the past decade or so have advertised job openings for open access and open scholarship librarians to be appointed in newly established organizational units such as offices of scholarly communication or digital scholarship services. Job listings such as these clearly illustrate an acknowledgement and a willingness on behalf of libraries to engage with evolutions in scholarly communication. At the same time, the creation of these positions and units might have strengthened the impression that these are new tasks for libraries, distinct from their traditional roles, and therefore best organized separately. And the question can be asked how much sense it still makes to organize this separately in a context where a very significant percentage of new scholarly articles are now published in open access, and open access books are becoming more and more mainstream. Are our libraries really prepared for this open access world? Or have they been lulled into a false sense of preparedness by creating these small teams in the margin without making substantial changes to the majority of legacy processes, such as acquisition and catalog? We have also seen another possible response in a new wave of university presses, founded during the past decade or so and quite frequently located, at least organization-wise, in the library. The question is whether libraries have taken full advantage of this blurring of the lines between publishers and libraries, and whether universities, which have decided to not go down that route and therefore do not have their own press within the library, are missing out or not. So lots of questions, but also excellent panelists to help us answer these questions and address related issues. So I'd like to close my opening remarks now and introduce our first speaker. And our first speaker is Joanna Ball, who is Managing Director of the Directory of Open Access Journals, the community-led open infrastructure that indexes and provides access to quality open access peer-reviewed journals, which you probably all know, and a lot of you probably use on a daily basis. Before joining the OIJ in 2022, she spent over 25 years in management and leadership roles in libraries in both the UK and Denmark, most recently as head of Roskilde University Library. Joanna is also the current chair of UKSG, the cross-sector charitable organization for the information community, which is known to all UK-based librarians and beyond. Particularly informative for the discussion today is the opinion piece she wrote in 2016 about the role of libraries and librarians in the changed world of scholarly communication, which I quoted at the beginning, and which provided the inspiration for this webinar. She followed this up with, amongst other things, an article published in Liber Quarterly in 2021, together with Graham Stone and Sarah Thompson, in which she highlighted the contradiction that libraries play an instrumental role in driving the transition to open science within universities, but that this typically is not reflected that much in their collection development, indicating that libraries may want and do a lot when it comes to open content, but still have a ways to go to truly reimagine themselves around open content as a norm. In short, I am very pleased that we have her willing to kick off this webinar and gladly give her the word. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Demi, for that introduction. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Can you see that now? Yes, super, excellent. Well, yeah, thank you for the introduction. I should say before I start that what I'm presenting now, they're very much my own views, not necessarily the views of the OAJ. And although I haven't worked in libraries for a couple of years now, I would say I still very much feel I'll always be a librarian at heart. So it's certainly from that perspective. It's also from the perspective of the global north, and I'm really pleased to see how many participants there are here from across the world, and I'll be interested to hear views from those participants in terms of how research libraries are responding to open there. So I've named the title of this talk, Where Are We Now?, which was the title of that article I wrote back in 2016. And I thought it would be useful to have a look or think about the landscape and think about how much it has changed and how much the role of libraries have changed since then. And also look at I suppose, what the challenges are for us now, or a spoiler alert, I think it's one massive challenge, and then the opportunities for us in future. So going back to that article from 2016 and actually the follow-on in 2019, one of the things that Graham Stone and Sarah Thompson and I recognised was that libraries were not prioritising open content over the alternatives. All of the workflows are still very much geared around purchased or subscribed content. And I think there really has been a shift since then. We are seeing more and more libraries making statements about the prioritisation of open. And I've just given an example of the University of Sheffield's content strategy here, in that libraries want to prioritise making open content available because it has so much wider value for the community and for their own users. The other significant move that I think we have seen is that libraries and their consortia are increasingly making new initiatives and routes for libraries to support open infrastructure, open content. And one example, I think, of this within the sector is Lyrasis and its Open Access Community Investment Programme. Demi already referred to this. Do we have the roles that we need within libraries? And are libraries' organisational structures set up to support open and really drive open? And I think he's right. We have seen an increasing number of open scholarship roles, open research, open science roles growing within libraries. I think most importantly, we have seen these quite senior appointments around open science and open research, which indicates that libraries are really prioritising this at a much more strategic level than just having a small team based in an office in the corner of the building, which doesn't relate to what the other teams are doing. And increasingly, I think that research is being seen as open research, so it's actually being absorbed into the roles that we already have, much more than it was previously. And then finally, the role of libraries within publishing, and I think that has also grown an enormous amount. And you can see just from these figures from the Library Publishing Coalition here that since 2016, many more libraries are engaging with publishing within their organizations. And I think another important development is that libraries they're not just working on this on their own, they are collaborating with others in the library sector to strengthen their services. So, for example, the launch of the Open Institutional Publishers Association in the UK earlier this year. So, what is the challenge? And I think this, I mean, there are lots of challenges, of course, but I think this is the big one that I see now and that I experienced in my last years within libraries, and it is that the transformative agreement acts like a kind of cuckoo in our ecosystem and in the nest of our ecosystem, and it pushes out smaller publishers, interesting initiatives that we might want to work on, and it takes up the budget and the time and the energy of libraries, so that it's difficult for them to focus on these other things. And I think we've taken that cost per download culture that I think we did have in libraries, and we've almost moved it into the transformative agreement area. So if you go to a conference now, or you read articles that are being published within the library world, so many of them are around how you analyze the value of a transformative agreement. So I think that's a big challenge for the community. But of course, there are lots and lots of opportunities. And I think one really positive thing we have seen in recent years is the really leading role that libraries are taking within the open access environment. Firstly, you have to mention the rights retention strategy, but the whole area of rights retention is a real victory, I think, for the amount of work that has gone in from libraries starting many, many years ago in terms of raising awareness of rights and of the importance of rights retention, liaising with researchers, advocating for this within their organisations. So I think that's a real marker for me in terms of the importance of libraries, as is DORA and other initiatives around research evaluation, and seeing that libraries are beginning to play a role in spreading good practice and advocating for good practice within their organisations at quite a senior level. I'd also say that this leading role goes beyond the walls of the institution and reaches out across the sector, and libraries are working with publishers, with researchers, with research institutes, for example, with COPIM around open monographs, and around the DMAS project, which is about institutional publishing. And one area which I probably know least about, but I know that I think there is huge potential in, is the area of open textbooks and open educational resources. We've seen a real push from libraries over the last few years around the ebooks SOS movement. And I think that there's an enormous amount of potential here for libraries to deliver open access textbooks and work with the academic community on open educational resources. And the other opportunity I want to mention is around the discovery of content, and libraries' very strong values around equity and diversity and inclusion, which I think we can really bring to play in this area. Now, one of the things we highlighted as part of the 29 article was the fact that our library systems weren't really fit for purpose in an open access world. I think we're beginning to see new systems develop which centre open content and make that the most important part of a library's holdings, as it were, and see the purchased and subscribed content as a supplement to that, rather than the other way around. And I think there are new systems, and I think there's also an opportunity for libraries to really push for development in perhaps the traditional systems and the systems that we're still using from 2016. And the other thing, which I think, again, is really exciting and aligns with libraries' values, is the move to promote tools that are more equitable. And we saw just last week, the University of Sorbonne announced that they were going to move away from the Web of Science and start using Open Alex. And I think this is a really exciting and positive step. We did some research at DOAJ earlier this year, where we found that half of the journals in our index were not indexed by Web of Science or Scopus. They are in Open Alex, and it was quite clear that we had a much more diverse range of journals in DOAJ than there were in either Web of Science or Scopus. So by promoting the use of these tools, libraries are automatically exposing their users to a much wider and much more diverse range of content, and also, of course, aligning with that decolonization agenda that's happening right now. I've got lots to say, but that's what I'm going to say for now. So thank you for listening, and I'm going to hand back to Demi.
Thank you very much. So maybe to make it clear, keep the questions and comments coming, put them in the Q&A box, and we'll just address the four speakers, the four statements at the end, rather than coming in after each speaker. So I would like to move to the second speaker, who's Anna Clemens. Anna Clemens has more than 20 years of experience working in information technology, digital transformation, and senior library roles in higher education. She held positions at the University of St Andrews and worked in the private sector before moving to the University of Sheffield, where she is Director of Library Services and University Librarian. Anna also serves on multiple boards and committees, including the JISC Library Strategy Advisory Group, the White Rose Libraries Executive Board, the OCLC Research Library Partnership, and the Executive Board of LIBER, the Association of European Research Libraries. These positions are an example of her particular interest in the leadership role of academic libraries in the transformation of research and education culture. A lot of people in the library world, both nationally and internationally, have noticed that the University of Sheffield has recently developed additional momentum and innovation when it comes to scholarly communication, open access, and open research. This, of course, has everything to do with the presence of Anna there. I therefore think that all of you are as keen as me to hear what insights she can bring in developments both within the library of the University of Sheffield and a broader perspective of how our library strategy can help to direct developments in open research. Anna, over to you.
Thanks very much, Demi. I'm just going to share my screen, and thank you for that lovely introduction. And also thank you to Joanna, because I'm going to pick up on some of those things that you've mentioned. Right, I'm share my screen, and hopefully that's okay. I'm assuming so.
Perfect.
So yeah, it's perfect. Wonderful. Thank you. I just want to give, because as we've got so many people from all across the world, I wanted to give a little bit of a background on the University of Sheffield and just where Sheffield is. So it's in the centre of the UK in England, in a wonderful part of the world called Yorkshire, which I'm sure many of you will be aware of. But we are I would say, a reasonably large research-intensive university in the UK. And I put just a few statistics up there for you to see. We're a member of the Russell Group, which is a group of 24 of the research-intensive universities in the UK. We have 30,000 students from 150 countries. And we have obviously alumni. We have 6 Nobel Prize winners, and we're ranked 104th in the world. Now, I am not really approving of university rankings, but I know in some cases it's quite useful to reference these. We were founded in 1905. And in terms of our research intensity, I think one of the key things that we have is our is that we have a very high is that we are one of the biggest universities that's concentrating on research-led manufacturing, which is very important to us as a research-intensive university. And we have oh, hang on, my technology is going a bit wild. So in terms of our the grants that we have and so on, we are actually in the top 10 of research grants. So that's the level of research intensity we have. But if we think about the university library more specifically, so we have 4 sites across the university. We have 3,000 study spaces. And I know Demi made reference to whether libraries should be just concentrating on supporting students rather than other areas. We have 150 staff and I have a £11 million budget. So that supports both the staff and the content. And we have what I would say is a quite traditional directorates within the library, so supporting research, supporting education, and supporting our cultural collections. But I think what's really important, and Joanne has already made reference to this, is that we are very, very keen to bring all these areas of the library together to consider what the open access agenda and wider aspects mean to our whole library, so that we're not actually seen in those silos. And I think what the important thing, or one of the most important things that is supporting us in that, is the comprehensive content strategy that Joanne has already mentioned, which we launched in 2021. And I just want to say this was down to a lot of the hard work from across the library, from all teams, but in particular from Pete Byers, our head of content and collections. And I think what's important about this strategy, and I don't know if anybody's going to be able to share a link with that, I have obviously got the link there as well on the slide, is that it is principles-based and it covers all areas of our operation. So how we provide access, whether that's through open access, the digital side, the ownership of the content that we provide, whether we're looking at subscriptions, and also it looks at infrastructure. And it also determines how we develop and manage our collections. And what we're not so much thinking about print versus digital or teaching versus research, but it's much more about our academic research collections ourselves. So the outputs that we produce, the data we produce, the code that we produce, our own cultural collections, which are unique to us, and obviously conservational collections, which are important to the sector where we work more closely. And importantly, which Joanna mentioned at the end of her presentation, was Open Educational Resources, which we feel are a critical part of this whole picture. But obviously, with all these collections, then we have to think about the financial implications and how we balance and prioritise between them. And it is our strategic aim, as you can see on the slide, to use our influence. And I know Ross has put in a comment about leadership, and I don't think it's about leadership. I think it's about our influence through the prioritisation of our budget and work, and obviously working collectively together, which has already been mentioned, with our research community and across the library and the broader academic sector, to facilitate a more ethical and equitable scholarly communications landscape. And that's all lovely words, and there are a lot of opportunities and challenges there. But I think deciding on the principle in the first place is really a key step. So over 5 years, we do aim to switch more and more of our content budget to support open scholarship, principally content and infrastructure, although we do support some projects. We're in the second year, so halfway through the second year, and it is a slow process. So if we look at the content budget, then basically about 5% of my budget is being spent on what I would call good OA. I mean, we can debate what we mean by good OA and if you like, bad OA. If we bring the transitional agreements in, and I will talk about transitional agreements a bit later, then that rises to 15%. So there is work to be done, but we are going along that path. And we obviously support various initiatives. So through SCOS, we support Diamond Publishing, we support there's just have a Community Open Access Fund as well. So we are supporting all those areas. So just quickly on sort of progress that we've made, and Joanne has mentioned many of these, but so rights retention. So the library led on the development of our institutional rights retention policy. We worked with academics, we worked with the research office, and we worked with obviously our governance office and so on. We also, at the same time as developing the rights retention policy, Vice Principal of Learning and Teaching was very keen for us to look at open educational resources as well. So we developed that in tandem. And both these policies came into force at the beginning of this year. And I think in terms of the rights retention policy and being able to make if we're complying with funded policies through the green policy, we can make our accepted manuscripts available immediately on publication with the CC BY. It has definitely reduced the workload and streamlined things for our academics and for our team. Now, obviously, we still do publish quite a lot through transitional agreements. For OERs, we were the first university in the UK to join the Open Education Network, and I have got staff in my faculty engagement team who are really, really interested in this, and we now have an academic-led Open Educational Resources Advisory Group who report to the Education Committee. And we also have a budget which is switched from, if you like, the more traditional part of my content budget to support staff who want to develop their own OERs. It's quite a small budget, but obviously we're trying to demonstrate the importance of OERs in order to be able to argue for more budget. Publishing negotiations, we're working with JISC in the UK and also with various others in the UK. We have had, if you can, in some ways you could argue they are successful negotiations with people like Elsevier, Springer Nature and so on, in that they have constrained costs. But I would argue, and this is probably a discussion we'll have, is where they've actually made a step change to where we are. And basically, have they just switched the paywall, if you like, from the paying to read to pay to publish? And I think that's a really good discussion that we can have. And it's very evident from an example of others like MIT in the US, where they have been able to contract with Elsevier for, I think, 3 years and been able to make considerable savings. And if you hear Chris Borg talking about it, no perceptible concern from the academics involved. The discovery side, which Joanna mentioned, yes, we do look at our discovery side and we consider what content we want to bring in. And we, of course, use DOAJ, DOAB, we look at core as well. And we do not make a distinction in terms of whether it's a priority over paywalled or open. So we're very keen that we want to have an inclusive discovery environment. On open research, we have an institutional open research statement, which is developed in collaboration with academic leads. The library itself leads on the FAIR data roadmap work. And we do quite a lot of work on advocacy, as you can imagine, engagement, and we use various workshops, conferences and so on. And indeed, Demi, you came to our first Open Fest, didn't you, a couple of years ago? And we have open research prizes and so on. This is all to sort of garner engagement and so on with our academic community. The White Rose University Press, so in the UK, 3 research intensive libraries in Yorkshire, Leeds, Sheffield and York. We've had a press since 2016. I think we're the second oldest fully open access academic-led press in the UK. And we are obviously non-profit. We have an academic editorial board. It's fully peer-reviewed, etc., etc. And the funding to support publishing for our academics at the moment comes from my content budget. Now, I expect that demand will increase as open access monograph publishing becomes more and more relevant for our academics. And finally, as I said, with our open scholarship budget, then it is quite clear that we're supporting all various aspects of open infrastructure. So, for example, supporting archives, supporting other preprint servers, and so on. But I'll turn, that's the sort of good things. But I do love this slide, which perhaps demonstrates where we are in terms of the business model in some areas, anyway. And I do, when I have conversations with other people outside the library or people who aren't aware of the business model, academic publishing, this is a very easy way to get it through to them that there is something wrong with the model. And I think transitional agreements, I think, are a misnomer. They haven't delivered a transition. Yes, more of the of what we publish in the UK is open access, but arguably, what is the sign that the large publishers, and here I'm talking largely about the large commercial publishers, are actually moving wholesale to open access as their model, because that was the intention. And the costs have not reduced, I would say. Arguably, we might have prevented some bigger costs that might have happened, but they haven't reduced. And to me, the issue is, or part of the issue, I think, is the fact that really the model when it's driven by profit and by large profits is really, it's like, if you like, incompatible absolutely with the scholarly endeavour. So I think there is a big problem for the sector. I think with monographs, in the sense there is an opportunity here, but it does keep me awake at night in the sense of where's the money going to come? Because, and also, how are we going to stop the pitfalls of with journal publishing, and we're going to end up with a market whereby those publishers that seem to be highly prestigious can charge effectively what they want through book processing charges. Now, it's obviously publishing monographs, it does cost, so somebody's got to pay, and obviously arts and humanities in particular are not particularly funded well. So there is an argument that we should aim to switch some of the budget that we support our STEM academics to support arts and humanities, and we are beginning to have that debate in Sheffield at the moment. And all of this is sort of the elephant in the room in terms of the research reward culture. And of course, this is an issue way beyond the agency of academic libraries. And Joanna obviously mentioned Dora, and we are involved in that. But in no way are we leading that, and we can't. And I do argue, though, that I think as libraries, as librarians and so on, we do have an important role to play through the engagement with our authors and our editors, and our editors in particular, actually, and are offering alternative models, as well as influencing the broad institutional and sector debate. So I suspect we'll have a bit of that debate later in this webinar. So that's the end of my presentation. I will stop sharing.
Thank you very much. Then we move on to the third panelist, who is Rachel Sandberg, who's an attorney and a program director at UC Berkeley's Office of Scholarly Communication Services. Her particular interests include scholarly communication, copyright, licensing, privacy, and ethics. She has been a project director for multiple grants to develop and teach scholars legal literacies for text and data mining in the US and cross-border research contexts. As program director of the Office of Scholarly Communication Services, she develops and oversees the program to help scholars navigate changes in publishing, information policy, and intellectual property, with a view to promote dissemination, accessibility, and impact. The office provides individualized support, instruction, and resources in fields such as copyright and research, publishing and teaching, authors' rights, open access, open course content, and scholarly impact. Needless to say, this means that Rachel is ideally placed to talk about her first-hand experience of developing such services in a research library, based on the realization of the centrality of scholarly communication and information policy within everything a research library does, and the need for, amongst other things, legal expertise, which comes with specialized rights issues within publishing and open scholarship to deal with the essential licensing issues. At the same time, establishing dedicated services for these issues can start to be more broadly felt than initially assumed, for instance, by affecting collections practices. And I look forward to hear her thoughts about that. Rachel, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Demi, and it's really nice to see all of you. Today, I'm going to highlight how, in some cases, the organization of how and where open access work lives within an academic research library, at least for ours in the US, falls short of organizational needs and opportunities. As Demi framed, the organization of open access may have been efficient at a time when libraries were changing rapidly to incorporate the pursuit, but the literacies and skill sets around publishing more broadly are now one of the most critical areas affecting library strategic planning, and open access's structural orientation within that deserves a rethink. So when it became clear to libraries that there was routine labor necessary to implement either open access strategy or open access policies, library publishing, or open access repositories, many academic research libraries in the United States established a single librarian to be in charge of OA, sometimes by calling them an OA librarian or a scholarly communication librarian, or even going so far as to create an Office of Scholarly Communication. The typical roles of such a librarian were, and to some extent still are, to conduct outreach to authors about what OA is, what OA options they have and what rights, whether copyright or other, they need to be mindful of when publishing generally, and particularly when publishing open access. Perhaps this person also manages an open access fund used to pay for article processing charges, or helps oversee the repository if the university has implemented a green open access policy. Now, there's never going to be a one-size-fits-all solution for institutions and libraries, and for some libraries, this model may have worked and perhaps still works. But from my perspective, the problems with this model are that it others the role of scholarly publishing and open access by making the concept seem like something that scholars are being forced to comply with, a box to tick, or perhaps even merely ignore. And further, it can set scholarly communication offices up to fail if they're relegated to this ancillary role, while the other liaison librarians or content selectors see publishing questions and rights issues as something they can deflect to scholarly communication and something that's overall orthogonal to public services work. The original structure also ignores the fact that the knowledge base possessed or developed by the scholarly communication librarian or team really extends to so many other areas of related library services. Indeed, what I hope more libraries can consider is a far more expansive role and structural orientation for scholarly communications offices that better integrates them into these other areas of library services so that efficiencies can be developed and real change can emerge. What do I mean by efficiencies? Here's just one example. If your scholarly communications librarian or team, as ours does, has responsible for developing open access investment decision-making principles, some of which we replicated for co-developing the Lyrasis OACIP investment program that Joanna mentioned earlier, then that team could also play a vital role in actually reviewing and negotiating journal or other content licenses to assess compliance with those open access investment principles, which is also work our office subsequently took on. And presumably, if your scholarly communications librarian is involved in open access, they could also have an understanding of copyright and other publishing rights issues. Or perhaps they expressly have a legal background. In fact, I'm a member of a group called UIPO, or University Information Policy Officers, which has around 200 members just like me across the United States with either legal training or law degrees and jobs situated within library copyright or scholarly communication offices. And with this set of expertise or legal backgrounds, we're able to not only unify open access investment decision-making with content licenses, but also review and negotiate electronic resource licenses more broadly and advise on privacy or accessibility, or oversee special collections licensing and digitization decision-making, and more. In fact, one of the things we're focused on at the moment, and you might see me respond to the Lib license listserv a little later this morning, is ensuring that our license agreements do not prohibit scholars from training non-generative AI using machine learning in the course of their text and data mining. And we can do that harnessing our skill sets. So depending on the needs of your institution and its scholars, it could make sense to take a much more expansive view of what a scholarly communication unit could take responsibility for or could advise on. And I will say in the US, these units are now starting to be called Offices of Information Policy, or at least positions that are directors of scholarly communication and information policy, directors of information policy, directors of copyright and information policy. The information policy is doing a lot of broad work here to encompass other areas of law, licensing, and publishing. And these broader units may have capability to undertake services like the traditional open access work of helping authors make publishing choices or communicating aspects of transformative agreements or other funding options. But they can also work with journal editors and publishers in guiding them and exploring ways to publish their journals, open access, and still maintain necessary revenue streams to sustain editorial functions. They could help authors and publishers and even the library staff review and draft publishing contracts that account for what rights authors are retaining in the publishing arrangement and what rights they're licensing to others. They could also guide instructors in understanding and leveraging their rights under copyright, whether that's in publishing or teaching. They could start supporting researchers like linguists, ethnographers, historians, and journalists in understanding rights and ownership and licensing issues with interview recordings and elicitations that they create, and how they can use agreements with interviewees to shore up rights issues that are otherwise entirely overlooked by institutional review board approval, which focuses on informed consent for human subjects research and not copyright or licensing issues. They could support researchers and authors in understanding how to incorporate copyright protected third-party content in what they're publishing, offer in-depth consultations with special collections donors, sellers, and curators to shepherd appropriate gift and asset purchase agreements. I could really go on and on. The skill sets that developed by folks with this background can really be pervasive. One of the greatest impacts that harnessing efficiencies, as I mentioned, can have is in setting sound policies for the library and in advocating for better policy or legal reform locally, nationally, and internationally to support researcher rights across the board. I'll just highlight a few recent examples that we've been able to achieve leveraging this. So on a local level, our office led a challenging but critical initiative that codified and overhauled the library's processes and policies for drafting, negotiating, and executing agreements, including acquisitions and electronic resources, gifts and asset purchases, oral histories, vendor digitization, publishing, and more. The new procedures bring the library into compliance with campus and legal requirements, but more importantly, yield far better rights outcomes and protections. We also established responsible access workflows that enable research libraries to navigate copyright, contracts, privacy, and ethical considerations when digitizing and providing access to special collections. We helped successfully change federal copyright law so that scholars can conduct text and data mining on literary works and motion pictures that otherwise would have been out of reach due to technological protection measures. And at the University of California system-wide level, we directly shaped the new UC system-wide copyright policy and the new policy on research data to make them more favorable for scholars' reuse rights and to better protect students and graduate student researchers. All of this was made possible because we were able to expansively leverage our work at the intersection of open access and rights issues for the greater good of the library and world. To that end, I'd like to say a few words about what an office set up like ours is able to achieve. We were established in 2016, and at the time it was just me. But even in extremely budget-challenged times, I've grown our staff to an office of 5 to help scholars with all of this work in a variety of ways. This past year, we provided 4,236 consultations, which represents a quarter of all UC Berkeley main library reference transactions. So to put that into perspective, the library has a staff of around 260 employees, and just 5 of us performed a quarter of all of the reference transactions, underscoring how crucial open access and scholarly publishing and information policy guidance is to researchers, faculty, and students at a large research institution like ours. If all of this sounds good or appealing, rest assured we have not cracked the scholarly communication structural nut yet. Although our office has now informal responsibility for information policy in all of these areas that I've mentioned, to some other units, it can feel more like tentacles that were taking over the organization. Without commensurate reporting structure, or without at least better nomenclature that makes clear that an Office of Scholarly Communication Services is really an office so well beyond open access and publishing and extends to information policy more broadly, we can and do face opposition within the organization. Even articulating that a team approach to service is being taken would help. But ultimately, there are huge cultural shifts needed to think about scholarly communication integrated in this way. And until then, lots of cultural and procedural hurdles that we face when trying to get things done. When it's time for questions, I'd also love to hear suggestions on what we should structurally do better. And if you'd like to find out more about what our office does, you can check out our annual report at the link here, or visit our website also shown here. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Then last but not least, we have Lai Ma, who is an assistant professor at the School of Information and Communication Studies at University College Dublin. Her research interests include research evaluation, research policy, peer review, information infrastructures, and scholarly communication. She is currently directing grant research on a variety of topics, including the cultivation of an open research culture in the humanities and social sciences, the increase of science literacy in the post-truth era, and sustainable and collaborative research information for bibliodiverse ecosystems. Some of you might be familiar with her recent published work, with or without colleagues, about replacing academic journals, about the platformization of scholarly information, about the role of scholarly communication in combating disinformation and misinformation, and about library publishing and bibliodiversity. With a profile and background like that, it comes as no surprise that we were convinced that Lai could provide an interesting perspective on the issue that interests us today, namely the role of research libraries in an open access world and the role of LITS programs, which are training the next generation of librarians. So Lai, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Dami, and hello, everyone. So again, I would like to thank Dami for inviting me to speak at this webinar. Actually, is a pleasure and an honor to speak amongst a lot of professionals who are much more experienced than me. So I started actually getting interested in scholarly communication when I actually first became the program director of the master's program here of library and information studies at University College Dublin. And I just felt very strongly that scholarly communication should be part of the curriculum because of the many challenges that I think the previous speakers have mentioned with regard to research assessment, open access and open research, and not to mention the professional role research libraries can play. So I started teaching scholarly communication in spring 2020, and I wrote a handbook published in October. But now I am actually a little bit kind of like, okay, so I have a lot to catch up after listening to Rachel's talk. Today's talk, I mainly will be focusing on, I think Dami actually told me to focus more on the more theoretical side of things, and then also from the perspective of an educator and also a researcher. So I would just say, so why scholarly communication fascinates me is that it is all about information. It is all about knowledge production. It is really about how researchers disseminate their work and interact with each other. So really, I have two hats here, right? One as a researcher and another one as someone who actually trains librarians, trains future librarians. As a researcher, so I think some of the questions actually in the Q&A are already asking about that. I was just tell you that I struggle to navigate the sometimes very contradictory demands of today's scholarly communication and research assessments world. For example, publishing in high impact journals indexed on commercial databases are still very much prioritized, I think, in many universities, in many countries. And that means publishing and supporting a new diamond open access journals can be detrimental to my career. And this is just one of the conundrums amongst other concerns, such as copyright transfer, post-publication peer review, misuses of research metrics, and so on and so forth. And as someone who teaches scholarly communication, I actually find it very important to convey to those who are interested in helping researchers and also actually for advocating open access to really actually understand researchers, their struggles, and how librarians can play a role. So because it is very clear that libraries play a very major role in assisting researchers with the publication channels, open access options, social media strategies, as well as some of the rights question, which I think in different research libraries, we might actually have different expertise, whether we have that level of expertise to advise on information policy and so on. So, but today I'm going to play a little bit of like a devil's advocate in the sense that in the context of open access, so we have heard about transitional agreements, transformative agreements, more or less mean the same thing, I think. And so they are being negotiated such that more articles can be open access, but for an escalating price. So I don't know budgetary, in that particular sense, how much more are we actually paying for open access articles, for example, in that particular context? But what I really want to talk about is the cost to the very core value of library and information professionals, which is information access. So in the sense that I raised this question, does open access or does good open access equal to information access? So there are a lot of questions involved here because libraries have the responsibility to ensure access to all kinds of information. What does that mean in research? That means that not only publications that are on popular or hot topics, not only publications that are written by researchers and scholars from the top-ranked universities. In the age of gold open access, however, we are essentially limiting access to research outputs by those who cannot pay. So these include researchers working in emerging areas that are not well-funded, which was previously mentioned. This includes researchers who are on precarious contracts or in between jobs. This also means researchers in low and middle income countries. So to a certain extent, the Go Open Access model essentially suppresses their voices and limit information access. And it is essentially not equitable, not diverse, and not inclusive. So are all Gold Open Access journals bad? Probably not. I would not say so. I mean, it is a very, very complicated questions there. But the business model does not mean that every publisher is predatory or making huge profits or publishing as many articles as possible, regardless of their quality. But I think a lot of problems lie in the business model itself. It is not saying that. I think some of the journals who are actually charging APCs, they're really trying to do the best job there. But this is particularly important also because of the function of collection development. I think some of the previous speakers also mentioned may deem irrelevant in the open access world. So the idea that there's no way we can control misinformation and disinformation that are already contaminating the scholarly records. And we are seeing more publishers of questionable practices and the publications therein are out in the open. So because traditionally that's the role what libraries play. We make sure that good information is out there, bad information will not be actually shared and disseminated. So I acknowledge that there are a lot of many demands and challenges research libraries face, but at the same time, we ought not to forget the core value of information access. And this is one important task for research libraries in the open access world. So I think that that's my very short presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then we can now move on to the Q&A. I have to apologize before we get to that because you've been very active and I think it's very unlikely that we will be able to address all the questions that have been asked, but I think that's a very good sign of the quality of our speakers and the fact that we have been provocative. And I would actually like to start us off with a provocative question that I really, really like. It is quite provocative. And it's a question by Daniela Hahn. She says, or she writes, libraries can only play a leading role in open access when they have the support and acceptance from the research communities. But she asked, and I think very rightfully so, why should we trust librarians and libraries in leading this process, considering that they have been complicit in building the current unsustainable publishing system? I don't know who wants to come in on that.
I'm happy to, Demi. Okay, you can hear me. No, I think it's absolutely a very good question. And I would probably agree that libraries have been tended to be risk averse and hide behind the fact that they can't make some decisions because of what their institutions might feel about it. I think that, well, I can only speak of the UK, and I think the landscape has changed. And probably what changed that, I would argue, others may have a different view, is the recent Elsevier negotiations with Elsevier that UK took a couple of years ago. And actually the Springer Nature negotiations as well, because both of those negotiations did galvanize the academic and the leadership of the institution. And obviously we in the library had the conversations and explained about the profits and about the enormous, well, in the case of Springer Nature, the €9,500 APCs, which is just outrageous. But so I think in that sense, there is now a willingness to listen to the library and to try and work with us on how we might be able to change that culture. But I think that as I said in my talk, or my presentation, we have limited agency. We can explain our experience, and we have the evidence, we have the usage figures, we have some of the tools, like the interlibrary loan tools are becoming more effective in perhaps mitigating some of the worst, the loss of immediate access to content and so on. So there are opportunities. So I think it's a little bit of a changed landscape. But as I said, that's from the UK perspective, so it might well not be the same perspective elsewhere.
Yeah, I saw that Rachel maybe wants to come in this.
Sure. I just want to build upon what Anna said and pick up on something that Sandra put in the chat around the whole system being complicit. It is a large complicit organism that eats itself, essentially. What I will say, though, in terms of how we can build more leverage is when researchers start to see that it impacts their work, libraries get listened to a little more. And I think Anna was touching on this a little bit in the negotiations. Those negotiations are possible only when researchers understand the impact of negotiations going one way or the other on what they're able to do. And in a concrete way, even if you set aside transformative agreement negotiations, let's look just right now at what's going around with publishers seeking to limit the ability of researchers to use machine learning to train AI to do text and data mining. The publisher gives the library that agreement. And what can the library realistically do? Now, if I'm in the library, I'm striking that language. I'm saying, look, as long as we're not making a competing commercial product that's going to reproduce it's first of all, it's not generative. It's not going to reproduce the underlying content. This should be allowed. And if you have folks like us in the library who are able, I don't know how successful we'll be with all of the publishers, but if you have folks in the library who are able to do that work, you can get farther. But the partnership with researchers is essential, because if they don't understand that if we can't get these rights, they can't train their tools to do text and data mining, then they're not going to understand why, they're going to think the library is useless. So while we need the expertise in the library, that partnership with researchers to show the impact of things going one way or the other is really the only way in this complicit system that we can begin to shift the power balance.
Should I move to another question unless somebody wants to come in? No. Then I have a question from Judita that I would like to tie it with another question that I saw a little bit further, is whether there are any plans or loose ideas or maybe best practices about upskilling library staff. to make them able to engage in supporting local publishing initiatives. There's a lot of talk, for instance, about, as Lai already said, about dominant open access, about scaling small, taking back control over the academic publishing process by academics themselves. But sometimes we seem to be lacking in staff resources to assist them. And library staff might be best equipped to adapt to such tasks. On the other hand, I also saw another question, which was something that came up with me too, is then, for instance, what Rachel was talking about, do we then actually need people with legal training? And is this not a hurdle if we expect now all of our librarians to basically also be lawyers before they can get to the library? That might be an issue too, if I'm honest.
Can I jump in first here? I'll take the second piece of it first, because I saw that question around, does everyone, or am I saying that everyone needs to be a lawyer? And I would say absolutely not. I am the only lawyer in our library, and if you asked many of the people who work there, they would be grateful that I'm the only lawyer in the library. But I have developed a staff who are interested in these issues. For example, Tim Vollmer is our scholarly communication and copyright librarian. Doesn't have a law degree, but has developed expertise to be able to do all of the same things that someone with a law degree is able to do. Michael Lang, who oversees our gift and asset purchase agreement negotiations and overhaul, no law degree, developed copyright expertise. E-resource licensing, I trained Samantha Teramy. So it is not, I do actually think that having training and having a team that's able to provide that, because by the way, I have a job to do. I'm not just opening a law degree issuing shop. So I think, if you devote resources to staff development, then absolutely it's possible. And I guess I will let other folks jump in. I do have thoughts on the first question, but I don't want to monopolize the answer.
Shall I come in, Demi? Because I think in terms of the skills development, that was probably direct. And it is interesting here. I think with the White Rose University Press, it was quite specifically set up as a joint venture between the three institutions and to bring the resource in and the expertise in, if you like, or rather than necessarily to build it up from internally. So additional resource was there. But I do absolutely, and I'm really interested in Rachel's description of what's happening at Berkeley in terms of the type of skills that you're bringing in that's available for the library, but also for across the institution. And I think obviously from a library director point of view and staff development, in looking at where we need to put our resource, there is always the opportunity to think where we should invest more. And we have obviously people who are copyright experts and so on that support, but from a legal point of view, that's absolutely something that maybe we should be looking at. Whether we'll get there, I don't know, but it's a very interesting suggestion. I think more broadly on this whole area of, if you like, library-led publishing. I mean, for me, I suppose what's key rather is the academic-led publishing or the academic-owned or accountable publishing. That's the important thing. And also, obviously, publishing is an expertise and a skill, and it's probably a difficult thing to learn. And so I think the quickest way to set that up to work effectively is to bring that expertise in. That would be my answer.
Yeah, go ahead, Joanna.
Yeah. Thanks. I could just add to that. I mean, absolutely, copyright and licensing are really important skills for librarians. And I can say at DOAJ, we usually know we're in safe hands if an academic-led journal is working closely with the library in terms of their copyright and licensing, because it means that they're usually going along the right lines. But I also wanted to come in around this idea of building up skills and building up capacity around library publishing, in particular around kind of the communities of practice that are building up in this area now, where I think one key element of that is where skills can be developed and experiences can be shared. There are tools out there like the Open Access Books Tools Kit or the Open Access Journals Toolkit, which can help library publishers kind of navigate their way. And this is also something that the DIAMAS project that I mentioned earlier on, the EU project, is looking at, is how to build a kind of capacity center to support these smaller initiatives, because not everybody, is able to have a copyright and licensing person in-house that can help.
Yeah, Lai, go ahead.
Sure, because talk about upskilling, I suppose because I train librarians, I have to say something about that, because it is very challenging in the sense that I don't think we have a copyright course for librarians at the moment. But at the same time, I do agree that we don't need lawyers, because I always teach my students to say that you're not giving legal advice. You're giving the kind of the knowledge that you understand what a researcher is, if they're signing a particular publishing agreements, what does that mean? And I think there are very kind of limited scope. It is not a lot in terms of like, what does it mean by granting exclusive license to publish, and so on and so forth. So that's one part of it. But moving on to kind of library publishing, which is another kind of, I think some of the things that we are considering, but at the same time, do we have scope to do so? And that would be another thing. And I think when I was at an event about library publishing, there are also a lot of questions about whether libraries would play the role of being a host, or you actually have the full package of the publishing, which means typesetting, which means copy editing, which means a lot of other things that actually the publishing industry has their own expertise, or rather it would be much more like institutional repository that the libraries can provide a platform for researchers to actually deposit their work. So I think, everything actually involves different sets of skills. And I think it is very challenging. As I said, I understand the challenges and demands and all of that to kind of think about responding to the previous questions as well, in the sense that, our library is complicit. Libraries also work in the university, and university rankings are important for a lot of institutions. And in that sense, open access becomes very, I think it is a challenging question here. So I'll stop here.
No, I completely, and actually kind of liked what Didi Dawson also said in the chat. I think one key element is also confidence, legal expertise. A lot of librarians do not feel confident in. I'm the same. In about 15 minutes, I need to teach a class about scholarly communication, not to library staff, but to PhD students in humanities, social sciences. I speak for about 10 minutes about copyright. 10 years ago, I would never have dared to do so because I don't have any legal training. Didi calls it confidence, I call it arrogance, but I thought this is so important. I need to talk a little bit about this. And I put the disclaimer that this is not legal advice. I'm just speaking from my experience of being in the system of scholarly communication for so many years now. This is what is happening and why you should think about this as an author. And I think that already does a lot. And I think librarians should feel indeed emboldened to do that, if you ask me. Maybe I know we're running out of time. There was one last question maybe that I wanted to address that comes from an anonymous participant, which addresses what Anna called the elephant in the room, research assessment. So research assessment appears to me extending from academic impact to wider societal impact. Also, research culture now plays a larger role in assessment. Where do the speakers believe responsibility of things like research integrity lie? There are new roles being created. You have research culture managers, research integrity managers, which indeed for me also seems about, we used to have open scholarship librarians 10 years ago. Now we have research culture managers, research integrity managers. Does this lead to more duplication, or can we break down these silos and maybe also let library staff address some of these issues?
I'll come in first, and I think there's been a lot of chat in the chat and in the questions about just the agency of libraries, and absolutely, we can't change research culture, and I think I said that in my opening remarks, but I think we do have a lot to offer in terms of influencing or just laying bare some of what we have to deal with it in, as library directors and our budgets, and making choices and presenting those choices to those that have to balance the finances higher up, and they've got students that they need to provide us an excellent student experience to. We've got pressures to publish more monographs, open access, etc. And where's the so there are ways that we can use our agency to influence those the thinking higher up. I think with research and integrity and so on, I think that's not within the remit at all of a library. That's with our colleagues in research services and research support. But an element of research integrity, which to do with the scholarly communications landscape, I think is an area where we can at least give our expertise, our opinion, and help to influence what the decisions are. So I think it's obviously a nuanced question, if you like, and there's no way that libraries can lead in the charge. And I think there's been reference to DORA and so on. But we do have, I think, an important role to play, and we need to make sure that we find those levers that we can use when we're speaking to those people that make the decisions. And often if I think about, I'm going to save money off a big deal, and I don't want the finance director to come in and grab that money back. Now, if I have a thought through an agreed plan, say with the Vice Principal of Research, of how we're going to spend that money elsewhere in terms of supporting open research culture, then I can retain that money. So we need to think it through in the whole.
Okay, maybe, unless, yeah, Lai wants to come in, go ahead.
Sure. I think from a researcher's point of view, and I also actually presented a few weeks ago about research integrity in relation to open access. I think one of the questions now for us is like whether there are actually too many publications out there, and all of those publications deserve to be in the scholarly records. And these are very big questions. And what could research libraries do? There's another question. And one of the examples I gave in that particular presentation is so the former president of Stanford University, he actually resigned due to falsified data in publications that he was one of the authors. Now, the case basically said that, well, he was not culpable, but he could have basically supervised the lab better. But regardless, he resigned. So that's a very kind of striking example. If more people know about this, and I think sometimes when we talk to perhaps university management and others, in the sense that we are actually really at the time where people are really kind of trying to churn out papers, and this is not good for the scholarly communication landscape. This is not good for our scholarly, the scientific records of what we are actually keeping. How much of it is misinformation and disinformation? We don't know anymore. So I think there are like these arguments to really actually rethink research assessments, to rethink, okay, what kind of open access will make sure that we have the kind of quality control, not necessarily all in the hands of research libraries, because research libraries all obviously have to work with researchers and universities and so on, and funders. So I'll pass on.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid this is all we have time for. I'm going to hand over to Ruby to close it off, but not before thanking you for joining, thanking all the panelists for this fantastic presentations. Thank you all for joining and participating so much. I think it's a very good sign that we have so many unanswered questions. So this will definitely be followed up in one way or another. And thank you very much, and over to Ruby.